Wonderful. I am now delighted, as Senator Brown had hinted, to carry on our dialogue with someone who has been a fearless leader in larger conversations on economics and racial equity. The chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters. Chair Waters, it is a pleasure to see you again.
Well, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And of course, I'm pleased to be speaking with you once again and to celebrate and reflect upon the meaning of Juneteenth. For so long, we have fought to keep the memory of Juneteenth alive, and I'm so happy to see it being recognized and remembered in a way that benefits such an important and defining moment in American history. Of course, we celebrate Juneteenth because it wasn't until, of course, 2 whole years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that Union soldiers finally notified the last few remaining enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, about their freedom. 2 whole years. It wasn't until that critical piece of news was delivered to that last community of enslaved people that the end of American chattel slavery was fully recognized. 19th reminds all of us that just because a presidential ended slavery doesn't mean that slavery really ended. Our celebration of Juneteenth carries forth this very important lesson. But none of us is free until we're all free. With Juneteenth approaching, I've been thinking a lot about what it means for Black Americans to really enjoy all the freedom, justice, and equality that was promised to us in the Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution. It is hard to miss or mistake the direct link between Juneteenth and the struggles that we face today. Black Americans are still fighting to remove the vestiges of slavery, especially in our economy, including freedom from the economic oppression we still endure, justice for the economic exploitation that we still suffer, and ending the inequality that has resulted from decades upon decades of economic exclusion that still persist. What does all of this have to do with how Black and brown banks can compete in today's digital economy? Well, it has everything to do with it. Our world is more advanced and complicated than ever. We have computers and the internet, and now here we are talking about cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, and other new emerging financial technologies. Some people are even now personally wealthy and well-connected enough to talk about packing all their belongings and preparing to live their lives on a whole nother planet. Meanwhile, Black Americans are still at risk of being looked over, left out, and left behind on this planet and in this country. We know from our history that new technologies and facing new frontiers do not guarantee racial equality. In fact, these things have a history of exacerbating racial inequality. Our mission, in short, is then to fight systemic racism all the way to the moon and back. For instance, as cryptocurrencies increasingly get used, hitting an astonishing $2 trillion in value in April 2021, it is imperative that people of color are not left behind. The technology must be harnessed to promote greater financial inclusion, and the industry must do more to hire and retain diverse talent. It's also why I have made it the people's business to make diversity and inclusion a top priority, including by creating the first ever Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee in Congress. The financial services sector covers a great deal, but today, let's start a little closer to home. why supporting minority depository institutions and community development financial institutions, known as MDIs and CDFIs, have long been a priority for me. More than 40 years ago, I began working with a community-based financial institution in my home state of California and was a founding director of the CDFI, Pacific Coast Regional. The lessons I learned from back then are just as relevant today. Minority-owned banks and credit unions and community-based lending institutions play a critical role as lenders in low-income communities and communities of color. Yet, even though financial regulators have a mandate to preserve and promote MDIs, for example, about 1 in 3 minority-owned banks and credit unions have somehow disappeared since the 2008 financial crisis. The numbers are starker for Black-owned banks. There were 41 Black-owned banks in 2008, and today there are only 18. When these MDI banks and credit unions disappeared, so with them disappeared additional affordable lending options to vulnerable communities who ended up being the hardest hit during COVID-19 pandemic. The loss of these institutions was especially felt when people have needed these options the most. So, after holding several committee hearings exploring the challenges minority-owned and community-based lending institutions face, I and my colleague, who you heard speak earlier today, Representative Gregory Meeks, introduced the Promoting and Advancing Communities of Color Through Inclusive Lending Act. The bill will provide the types of investments and mechanisms we need to strengthen and grow the number of MDIs and CDFIs in our communities. I would also like to take this moment to thank my colleague, Senator Mark Warner, who will speak to you a little later. I worked closely with Senator Warner to reach a bipartisan compromise last December with Senators Mike Crapo and Sherrod Brown, and Ranking Member Patrick Henry to secure a historic $12 billion in capital investment and grant programs to strengthen MDIs and CDFIs. We know that these lending institutions work and have been a financial lifetime at getting communities of color the capital and relief they've needed to survive the economic crisis. Since the tragic murder of George Floyd, big banks and other corporations have committed to provide tens of billions of dollars of equity capital to support Black-owned banks and other MDIs and CDFIs to help redress outstanding racial wealth and economic gaps. These investments have the potential to help these institutions secure the technology they've needed to scale and provide better opportunities and investments into the communities that they serve. But even with these contributions, MDIs and CDFIs remain only a tiny sliver of our $21 trillion US banking system. This is the case even though they punch far more their weight in serving Black and Brown communities and have a better track record in lending to Black and Brown customers. It will be nearly impossible to reach the new customers needed to compete in the digital economy without ongoing investment in cutting-edge financial technologies, social media outreach, mobile apps, and the costly product development needed to break through the noise and remain competitive. So we must do more than narrow this gap in investment. We must close it. I recently convened a hearing with the big bank CEOs to ensure they're following through with their commitments to provide MDIs and CDFIs, and I will to support these MDIs and CDFIs, and I will continue to encourage the private sector to do what it can to strengthen these diverse and mission-driven financial institutions. I also created the first ever task force on financial technology and task force on artificial intelligence that will collectively look at how we can promote greater financial inclusion in this digital age, but we cannot rely on the private sector alone to bring about the systemic change we so desperately need. We must also seize this moment to remedy the harmful legacy and decades of chronic disinvestment in these institutions and, by design, the communities that they serve. Senator Warner and I have since formed and we lead the Community Development Finance Advisory Group along with key stakeholders. The first focus of this group is to get real-time feedback to help us oversee the Treasury Department and the CDFI funds, implementation of the $12 billion of MDI and CDFI programs, and ensure they work as intended. We will also explore other actions Congress, federal agencies, and the private sector can do to provide even more support for these institutions. Yes, there's a lot to cover in financial services, and to make sure the sector is serving everyone equitably. As Professor Brummer said in a podcast interview that we did together a while back, there is a great canvas of this enormous universe of issues, from banking to financial technology to artificial intelligence. And like I agreed, many things are happening in our economy, more new ways of doing business. We need your voices to contribute to those emerging issues. To that end, I'd certainly like to take this moment to thank Professor Brummer for being such a contributor. In the past, he has briefed members and testified before the Financial Services Committee on cryptocurrency, and he, along with Brookings Institution, have drawn attention to the historic absence of Black appointees leading financial regulatory agencies. These are exactly the type of contributions we need. I also would like to thank one of our Community Development Finance Advisory Group members, the Black Economic Alliance, as well as its executive director, Mr. David Clooney, for co-sponsoring this event and for calling for a more inclusive economy and supporting legislation that encourages just that. We have to be willing to perform the research, conduct the oversight, and make the investments and support the legislation to confront these issues head on and to ensure the financial services sector is fair and inclusive. So I thank you for inviting me to participate in your Juneteenth celebration today. And I hope to be back with you all very soon to partake in even more discussion on these issues. To Professor Brummer, while I have attempted to thank you for all of your contributions, I am exactly and very much impressed with you, professor at such a prestigious university, taking Juneteenth as a teaching lesson. I never thought I'd see this. A few of us celebrated Juneteenth, maybe in our backyard with a few friends, and we had a little strawberry soda water or, cornbread or something. But it has taken on a new meaning. And I'm going to be in a Juneteenth parade with a bunch of young people on Juneteenth. And of course, I'm going to be in what we call the Village in Los Angeles, where all kind of activities are going on. And my office has been notified about 12 other Juneteenth events that are going on. And so something new and different is taking place. But in all of this, the Professor Brummer with Juneteenth.
Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you.
That we have today is very, very exciting and inspiring. And thank you so very much.
Thank you so very, very much. You are wonderful. I admire you. You know how much I admire you. And thank you so much for showing up for this. It is Juneteenth. It is a celebration. And I'm going to now move on to the next panel. I know that you apparently have some business on the floor. Your staff has been letting me know. So, okay. But thank you very, very, very much. And we'll move on to our panel.
Thank you.